It's delightful to be here with you once again, and see several of you that I have seen of recent date. Happy to have the Sanders up here with us from down in southern Arkansas. I was there the early part of this month. Seems like this has been my travel month. I had, I guess, on the second Sabbath in September, had been in Alexandria and Monroe, Louisiana, for a regional trip, visiting those churches pastored by Mr. Jonathan McNair, and then on Sunday up to Camden for a Bible study. Mr. McNair also oversees that congregation, and so anyway, we last week, by the way, bring you greetings, those of you particularly who used to be over in the Memphis area, Mr. and Mrs. Popielski, who are now down in Jackson, Mississippi. We were serving, we went over last Sabbath and visited the churches in Jackson, Mississippi, and Laurel, Mississippi, pastored by Mr. Dan Hall, and stayed with Popielski's last Friday night. They're doing well, and things are growing and going forward there in that area. Well, brethren, we're here on a very special occasion. We're here not only on the weekly Sabbath, but today is a very special Sabbath. It is a high day Sabbath. It is that day that is called in Scripture the Feast of Trumpets. God says to His people through Moses in Leviticus 23 that on the first day of the seventh month there shall be unto you a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. We're here to celebrate a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. Now, a memorial is something which is designed to keep us in memory of something. Sometimes a monument is erected, and it is a memorial to a particular event or to a particular person. Jesus Christ told His disciples at the time of His final Passover with them, as He took the bread and as He took the wine there on the table, and He blessed it and gave it special significance, He told them, He says, "This you shall do in memory of me," or as a memorial of me. It was to be done having a special significance, recognizing what it reminded us of. Because the purpose of a memorial is to serve as a reminder, to bring us into remembrance of a particular event or a particular person. We are here to celebrate something that God tells us is a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. It is a reminder. It is to bring us into a remembrance of the blowing of trumpets. Or, as you really begin to study into it, literally the blast of the shofar. Because the shofar, the ram's horn, is the particular trumpet that is there. There are metal trumpets, silver trumpets that are mentioned elsewhere in the Old Testament. But on this particular day, the shrill blast of the shofar was sounded. Now, you know, today, if you'd be listening along to the radio and all of a sudden something comes on and they say, we're going to have a test of the emergency broadcasting system. You know, you wait a minute and all of a sudden this loud sort of a piercing noise comes on and you listen to it for a little bit and they come back and they tell you, this is only a test. If this had been the real thing, we would have told you, to tune in. Because the whole purpose, of course, of an emergency broadcast system is what? It is to warn us of something, to sound an alarm. It is a warning. Generally, in something like that, it would be for an approaching storm or something of that nature. In ancient times, they didn't have an emergency broadcast system on the radio or on television. You didn't dial 911. You had an emergency. Rather, there was, though, the sounding of the shofar. This shrill, piercing blast that could be heard literally for several miles as it would travel. This sound of alarm would be sounded from the city. If there were from the walls of the city, if there was an approaching enemy, warn people who were working out in the fields to quickly take refuge behind the city walls because there was danger that was spotted in the distance. It was a sound of alarm. It was a sound of warning. And you find many places in the Scripture where it's talked about. Now, we're here on a very beautiful day. We were out in front. Many of us were gathered out there visiting for a while before services because of the delay in being able to get in. Now, considering the kind of weather that we were having even the very beginning of this month. Today was if you're going to be outside, today was a nice day. It was pleasant. Temperature was pleasant. A little bit of a breeze blowing. Beautiful sunshiny day. Those of you who had a long drive in, I'm sure you enjoyed looking up at the blue sky and looking at the beautiful countryside. It was beautiful. And when we are living in a time when around us things are peaceful, we have the table set up back there, and there's going to be great bounty spread in just a matter of a short period of time. We're going to be enjoying a festive meal. We have so much as we look around. We are in a time of relative peace and tranquility, most of us, in terms of our lives, in terms of even the day itself, in terms of the food and the abundance of physical things that we have. And it is very, very difficult for us in a time such as this to fully grasp, to fully perceive what is going to transpire between today and the time when this day is fulfilled in its reality. We anticipate and we look forward to the fulfillment of the festivals of God, to the fulfillment of the plan and the purpose that God is working out. And it drags on. Some of you are celebrating the Feast of Trumpets for, many years, many decades. Maybe 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. We look back over the years as we have celebrated the Feast of Trumpets, and we anticipate the time when this day will be fulfilled. Brethren, the time is really coming when the fulfillment of this day will have been yesterday. The time is really coming when we're going to be living the day after the return of Jesus Christ. The day after the fulfillment of these things. I think that it is appropriate at certain times that we step back and try to get a little bit of an overview in terms of Bible prophecy, in terms of the things that are going on and the things that will go on, the unfolding of events. Obviously, we can't cover everything in one sermon. Can't even cover everything in two sermons, but we will give a stab at it. I want to set the stage, and by the way, I might just mention that there have been interestingly, a couple of very significant events that have occurred just in the last few days. One, of course, is in the Middle East. The situation is very volatile. You remember just on the day prior to the Feast of Trumpets, there was an armed clash there at the Temple Mount. There were, at least last report I heard, at least 4 Palestinians who had been killed by Israeli forces. It is a very major and serious situation that is building. Pressures are escalating. Of course, right at the same time, it's amazing. What the newspapers cover and don't cover. There was an election in Denmark, a referendum having to do with whether or not Denmark would join the euro. Denmark, there are 3 nations right now. There are 3 nations who are members of the European Union that have not chosen to replace their currency with the euro and to come fully as a part of that system. And that is Denmark, Sweden, and Britain. Those are the 3 that have to this point opted out. And there has, of course, been great pressure to try to bring everybody totally on board because they have a direction they're going. And what they want to create, and they're openly talking about it, is a new federal state that will completely swallow up all of the nations that have been hitherto independent. Denmark rejected in their referendum, as I understand, somewhere by about 55% rejected the joining the euro, which of course escalates tensions over there because nations like Germany, who, by the way, guess where the central bank in Europe is? It's right there in Frankfurt, the old financial seat of the Holy Roman Empire, actually, sort of funny, the very building that they're using there is the is the location that was manufacturing poison gas just about 55, 60 years ago, and so now they've got this is the financial center. Well, since Denmark has rejected it, and things are very divided in Britain and Sweden as well. So there is a pressure. There are things that are happening in Europe. There are things that are happening in the Middle East. The stage is being set. The stage is being set. And the time is going to come when the curtain will rise on the third and final act. And, you know, if you've ever attended a play, and I guess most of us have, high school plays or some other sort of play, that you know, curtain opens and the scene is set and the characters say their lines and they carry out their part and the curtain rings down. And that particular act is over. The curtain rings down and a few minutes pass and the curtain rises. And when the curtain rises, you find out that all sorts of things have been happening. That the stage has been a very busy place during the time that the curtains have been down and the lights have been dim. Because all of the scenery has been rearranged. And when the curtain rises on the next act, the stage has been reset. And there is now, the next act is beginning. We are in the period right now where the curtain has rung down. And the scenery is being rearranged, as it were. And the time is going to come when the curtain will rise. And when it does, the stage will have been set for something totally different. We need to understand that just a matter of years ago, right at this fall festival season, in the fall festival season of 1989, the post-World War II era passed from the scene. Europe, which had been arranged had been divided up at Yalta, that whole system of a bipolar world dominated by the Soviet Union and the United States, the nations behind the Iron Curtain and the nations of Western Europe, this dichotomy that existed in Europe that seemed the eternal order of things. Our leaders and our government administrators and people in high position had no glimpse, had no glimmer of the fact that that system, that arrangement was on the verge of passing from the scene and would simply be no more. And that, of course, is happening. In just a matter of weeks, like dominoes, things began to happen. Things began to change. Increasingly, the pieces on the stage are being rearranged. And the time will come when the curtain will rise and the final act will begin. Now, let me show you back in 2 Thessalonians. I'll show you exactly where we are in terms of Bible prophecy, in terms of that arrangement. Second Thessalonians 2:3. We're at the comma in the middle of the verse. Paul said, "Don't be shaken or troubled," verse 2. Verse 3, "Let no man deceive you by any means. That day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." There were two things that had to occur. One was a falling away. The term in the Greek is apostasia. Where we got our English word apostasy from. It means a departure from the truth. There would be an apostasy. There would be a departure from the truth. Brethren, I don't think there can be any doubt that we have passed that point in the flow of prophecy. I cannot imagine any way to have a falling away, an apostasy on a greater scale than what we have experienced in recent years. That day will not come except there come a falling away, an apostasy first. Now, the next thing that's going to happen, that's why I say we're at the comma in the middle of the verse. Because the next thing, and that man of sin will be revealed, the son of perdition. Now, there have been many men of sin down through time. There have been many individuals who have been certainly individuals of lawlessness. But this is a particular man of sin. The man of sin who is called here the son of perdition, one who will oppose and exalt himself above all that is called God. One that will be destroyed, verse 8, that wicked will be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, destroy with the brightness of his coming. This is that final wicked one, that man of sin that will be destroyed by Jesus Christ at his return. That final great man of sin, that individual who exalts himself. Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 24 the fact that there would be individuals who would accomplish great things, as it were. He talks about in Matthew chapter 24 that false prophets would arise. Matthew 24, in Matthew 24:11, he talks about as it goes on that there would be in verse 24 false prophets that would show great signs and wonders, inasmuch that if it were possible they shall deceive the very elect. Great signs and wonders. Other scriptures talk about lying wonders. Lying wonders. Satan is a liar. He's the father of a lie. Jesus Christ talked about this individual. Now, the appearance on the world scene of this man of sin will signal the beginning of something. Notice in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is just that. It is an unveiling. It is a revealing to show the servants of God the things that must come to pass. In Revelation chapter 5, the Apostle John saw in the right hand of the one who sat on the throne, in other words, the right hand of God the Father, a book or a scroll written within and on the back side, and it was sealed with 7 seals. And the question was asked, who is worthy to open the book? And the only one that was worthy to open the book was the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, the one who is the Savior, the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ. And so in chapter 6, verse 1, the Lamb opened one of the seals. And as he opened the seals are consecutive. And as he opens a seal, he unrolls a little ways until he comes to the next seal. You know, seals were placed on documents in ancient times. The king sent a letter. Commonly, documents being linked were written on a scroll. Now, if the king was sending an important document to some of one of his servants or one of his governors or appointees in another area, he didn't want just anybody and everybody opening it up to see what he was telling. He wanted it confidential. Well, they didn't have all the technology of today, but they had a very simple means. There was a signet ring that existed that was on the hand of the king, and there was none other like it. And when a document was closed up, hot wax was melted there on it to seal the edges together. And the king, while the wax was still warm, pressed his signet ring into the warm wax. And of course it very quickly cooled and hardened, and the insignia was there in the wax, right there on the seal, on the seam. Now, the rule was that when the document was delivered, you could tell that the seal had been broken, because while you could reheat the wax and smooth it back over, you couldn't re-impress the signet there. You could tell. And if the messenger showed up with a document where the seal had been broken, then he was executed. That was the end of the story. So he had great incentive to make sure that the seal was never broken except by the one who was authorized to open it. Because it was a document that contained important information, and it was only accessible to the one whose right it was. Jesus Christ was the only one authorized to open the book. And when He opened the seals, one by one, when He opened the first seal, Revelation 6:2, I saw, and behold, a white horse, and him that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. And He opened the second seal, and the second beast said, Come and see. And I saw another horse, the red horse. Power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, that they would kill one another. He was given a great sword. The third seal was opened, and John was told, Come and see. And he saw a black horse, and one that sat on the black horse had a pair of balance scales in his hand. And he was told that he heard a voice saying, A measure of wheat for a penny. Now, a penny or a denarius was the wages, the common wage for a laborer for one day. At that time, it was a day's wages. So what he sees is small quantities of grain being measured out, sold for a day's wages. Very high prices for food, great scarcity. Then he saw, when the fourth seal was broken, a pale horse, and death sat on him, and hell, or Hades, the grave, followed him. He had the power to kill a fourth of the people who lived on earth. Now, let's notice the sequence here. The starting point is the white horse. The one who sits on the white horse, Christ said, many will come in my name. You read about a white horse back in Revelation 19, but the one that sat on the white horse in Revelation 19 is quite distinct from this one. Here, we find the one who sits on the white horse in Revelation 6, verse 2, has a bow. And the bow is the symbol of Nimrod, the mighty hunter. This is the one who comes masquerading as Jesus Christ. But in reality, he is the successor of Nimrod, not of Christ. Paul talked about in 2 Thessalonians the mystery of iniquity. See, in the context of this final man of sin who will be revealed, he talks about the mystery of iniquity does already work. That system was already beginning in the days of the Apostle Paul, and yet it would be held back. Something would restrain until the time when that final individual would emerge out of the midst. When the final man of sin comes on the scene, he's not going to show up with a sign around his neck saying, I'm a false prophet. I'm the successor of Nimrod. I'm here to deceive you. I'm here to mislead you. Oh, no. He is going to be considered the great power of God. Ultimately, he is going to be considered. He's going to try to convince everyone that he is literally God incarnate before all is said and done. He appears on the scene. What we find in 2 Thessalonians, that day will not come except there be a falling away first and apostasy. Then the next thing that will happen is that man of sin will be revealed, the son of perdition. That is the beginning of the sequence in Revelation 6. That is the first seal. When the man of sin is revealed, that begins the sequence of Revelation 6. There is going to emerge on the scene a great religious leader. Now, there are a lot of things that happen prior to then in the sense of setting the stage. Because when time comes for events to happen, things can happen oh so quickly. Mr. Meredith has used the expression that we're in a time of transition, and we are. Brethren, you and I have the opportunity of using these halcyon days, this peaceful time, as it were. And we can use it either to be spiritually ready, or we can use it as a good opportunity to take a nap. The trouble is going to come when all of these events begin to come about. We've either slept through the prelude and we start trying to scurry around and get ready and find out the time to get ready is past. The time to get ready is now. Because when these events begin to happen, they will happen very quickly. The white horse will ride forth, this great religious leader. There will be a great emotional fervor that will begin to sweep over much of the earth, beginning there in Europe. This so-called revival, spiritual renewal. There will be an individual who will work all sorts of great signs and lying wonders, things that are so impressive that if it were possible, even the very elect would be deceived. Now, the reason the very elect would not be deceived is because you know what to look for. We're told in the book of Isaiah, to the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, it's because there's no truth in it. It doesn't matter if somebody brings a frog out of the, out of the pond or does some great, impressive-looking thing. Simon Magus bewitched all the people of Samaria with his sorceries, and they decided that he must be the great man of God, the great power of God. Well, you can look down through time. There have been all sorts of great, impressive things. When this religious leader comes on the scene, and there is a situation that begins to spread this religious fervor. You know, people today are not looking primarily for doctrine. They're not looking for truth. They're looking for feelings. They're looking for something to help them feel good. That's why there's so much growth in the charismatic churches, because what they offer them is a feeling. They offer them excitement. People come away all pumped up, charged up emotionally. When this individual comes on the scene, and the spiritual event that will set the stage for this is Satan being cast back down. And there will come this sequence that the rider on the white horse, that man of sin, will come to prominence. There will follow warfare and famine and death. There will follow chaos in his wake. There will be a time of great turmoil. It's in the context of turmoil. It's in the context of when people are scared and frightened that a great political savior will appear on the scene in Europe. One to whom 10 great leaders in Europe will give their power. This will constitute the final resurrection, the seventh resurrection of the old Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, as it were. The seventh time of renewal for that. That will come on the scene. There will be a number of events that will follow as these things, this system, holds sway. The events that are described here, the warfare and the disease and death. If you notice back in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 5, well, Ezekiel chapter 4, Ezekiel was told to to sort of act out something. He was told to take a piece of ceramic tile and to make, as it were, a model city. A model of the city of Jerusalem. And he was to prepare around it as though there were battering rams and there were soldiers and there were all this sort of stuff. The people would gather around, they were looking. And he was told, at the end of verse 3, Ezekiel 4 verse 3, this shall be a sign to the house of Israel. Now, at the time Ezekiel was writing, the house of Israel had been in Babylon, had been in Assyrian captivity for over 100 years. Jerusalem was being threatened by the Babylonians. Ezekiel acted out a siege of Jerusalem, which lay yet a few years in advance. But he was told, this shall be a sign to the house of Israel. This is for the end time. The house of Israel was already in captivity. This was not primarily a sign for the house of Judah. Now, as you come on down into Ezekiel chapter 5, Ezekiel was told to take a sharp barber's razor and to shave his head and his beard. And he was then to take the hair and to divide it 3 ways. And that this represented something, dividing it into these thirds. Verse 12, a third of you shall die with the pestilence, with disease, and with famine, and shall be consumed in the midst of you. A third part shall fall with the sword round about, and I will scatter a third part into all the winds, and draw out a sword after them. Verse 14, I'll make you waste and a reproach among the nations that are round about. This was a sign to the house of Israel. This lay in the future, not in the past. Ezekiel wasn't going back and trying to write something that applied to 100, 125 years ago. He was writing of something yet future. A future captivity, a future destruction. And he talked about warfare, famine and disease, and captivity. Now, when we read in Revelation 6 with the seals being opened, we find that in the aftermath of the white horse, in the aftermath of that great final man of sin, the events that follow are warfare and famine and disease. Now, there is a logical progression there. You know, if you consider what the progression normally is. First, here with false religion, you get people all stirred up. And that, of course, leads into warfare. What is the outflow from warfare? Well, you have destruction, physical destruction. But, of course, when you have that, you have disruption of transportation, you have disruption of agriculture, you have massive disruption. And so what happens in the aftermath of warfare is famine. And in the aftermath of famine is disease. We have that on a smaller scale all over the world. You go into a place like even there in the Balkans, you know, after the warfare, what happened? Well, all food was destroyed, and so we sent in food relief because you know that in the aftermath, when there are food scarcities, people are reduced to starvation, and disease very quickly breaks out because their bodies are weakened and their immune system is weakened, and so there is the logical progression of warfare into famine, into disease. These go through. Now, Ezekiel 5 talks about that. God talks about verse 16 to the house of Israel, that I'll increase the famine upon you and will break your staff of bread. I will send upon you famine and evil beasts, and they will bereave you, and pestilence and blood shall pass through. And I'll bring a sword. Now, it talks about bringing the sword here in chapter 6 of Ezekiel. Verse 6, in all your dwelling places the city shall be laid waste. Yet, verse 8, I will leave a remnant, that you may have some that shall escape the sword among the nations when you be scattered through the countries. And they that escape of you shall remember me among the nations where they shall be carried captive. You see, there is coming a time, a future time of captivity. God inspired the apostle, or the prophet Jeremiah, to write here in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7, Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, and he shall be saved out of it. Then God talks about breaking the yoke and bringing back Jacob from his trouble, from that captivity. He said, a time of Jacob's trouble, a time that there is none like it. A time of unparalleled, unsurpassed trouble. Jesus Christ said in Matthew 24:21, Then shall be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world of this time, no, nor ever again shall be. There can't be two times of trouble worse than any other. The time of Jacob's trouble is the time of trouble worse than any other. Daniel talks about it in Daniel 12. Jesus talks about it in Matthew 24:21. You see, when you go through the sequence here in Revelation chapter 6, we find that these four seals are open, these first four seals, and the horsemen ride forth. The white horse, the red horse, the black horse, the pale horse. Then the fifth seal is opened, verse 9. And John sees a vision of martyrdom. He sees, as it were, under the altar. They're describing, he's there and transported in vision to heaven, and he sees, as it were, under the altar, the lives of those who were martyred. And he's told that they were to remain yet asleep, yet in their graves for a little while, until their fellow servants and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. That's mentioned in Revelation 6:11. You know, under the altar, the blood of the sacrificial victims was poured out under the altar in the temple. And the blood thereof is the life thereof. It symbolized the lives of those who were sacrificed. When John saw the souls or the lives of those that were martyred, historically, the message was that their blood cried out, as it were. Well, you know, righteous Abel, we're told in Genesis, God said to Cain, he says, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. If the blood of one righteous martyr cried out, with how much louder voice did the collective blood of every righteous man and woman who has been martyred from the time of righteous Abel all the way down through the centuries? And yet, John was told here, as he saw the fifth seal open, that there was coming a future time of martyrdom. Because you remember that when Satan is cast back down, he's very angry. He knows that he has but a short time. And he goes to make war. Goes to make war with the remnant. With anyone that he can get. It is a time of, the great tribulation is Satan's wrath directed against the house of Israel and against God's church. Physical Israel and spiritual Israel. Now, as we go on through Revelation 6, we find that the sixth seal is opened in Revelation 6 verse 12, and there's a great earthquake, and there are great signs in the heavens. And that is the prelude, verse 17, for the time when the great day of his wrath has come. The tribulation is Satan's wrath. Satan's wrath directed at the people of Israel, directed at the spiritual Israel of God, the church of God. You see, as this great religious leader appears on the scene and begins to whip up everyone into a great emotional fervor, and there is turmoil that is unleashed, and there is turmoil and tumults in the midst of our nation, and the civil strife and unrest, and the breakdown of order, and there is violence, and there is famine, and there is disease. And there arises on the scene this great political leader called the Beast, the final great leader of this revived Roman Empire. And as that system begins to enforce its dominance, intervening in the Middle East and intervening in the Israelitish nations, there is a time of destruction that is going to come, a time of captivity, a time of the cessation of this nation as we have known it. There is a system that holds sway over the face of the earth. But as we come right through the sequence of Revelation 6, we find that the stage is set for the intervention of God Almighty. The heavenly signs, the sixth seal, sets the stage for that event called elsewhere in Scripture the Day of the Lord. Now at this point, Revelation 7, John says in verse 1, after these things, after the opening of the sixth seal, after the heavenly signs, I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth holding the four winds, and another angel ascending from the east having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea. That's what the next four plagues involve. It says, don't hurt the earth or the sea or the trees until we've sealed the servants of our God in their forehead. Now 144,000 of the tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe, are set apart, are sealed at this point. And normally when the Bible talks, seal is that evidence of authenticity. A seal authenticates genuineness. When you have a legal document, you have to have it notarized. You get it sealed. Notary affixes a seal. The purpose of that is to authenticate the genuineness of the document. When we are sealed, we are authenticated as genuine. Now, frankly, what is it that seals us? Well, we're sealed with the Holy Spirit promise, the Apostle Paul explains in the book of Ephesians. It is God's Holy Spirit that seals us. Now, if you've been baptized and have the Spirit of God, you are sealed in your forehead right now. There are those asleep in the grave who were sealed. And they are sealed until the day of the resurrection. You and I are sealed when we receive the Holy Spirit. Here is a future sealing. It's future because it occurs after the sixth seal and before the seventh. So it is an event that is yet future. And it involves the setting apart of these individuals who have rejected allegiance and loyalty to the beast system. And of course, now what are they facing? Well, there is tremendous pressure being brought to bear. Tremendous pressure being brought to bear to worship the beast in his image, to give loyalty and allegiance to this system. And if you were to live your life based on sight, then what your eyes would tell you is that you'd better go along in order to get along, because you're not going to be able to survive, seemingly. That's what physical evidence tells you. But spiritual evidence, faith tells you that you better serve God and trust Him, and regardless of what is going on in the world around you. You know, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what their eyes told them was, you better bow down and worship the image like everybody else, because if you don't, He's going to throw you into a fiery furnace, and then you're going to burn up. That's bad. You don't want to have that happen. You better do what He says. If you're going to rely on physical evidence, that's the conclusion you would reach. But you see, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saw something beyond the physical. They saw God, the reality of God. And they told Nebuchadnezzar, we don't have to take time, talk it over, and figure out what we're going to answer you. We're not going to worship your image. We're just not going to do it. The God whom we serve is able to deliver us. And even if He doesn't, we're still not going to bow down and worship your image. Here are individuals who are sealed, who are set apart at this point. And then John sees in vision on way beyond that. You see, this is the beginning of the story, as it were. John sees this vision after these things, after the sixth seal, before the seventh, things are held up. But then he looks on down over 1,000 years, and he sees a great multitude that no one could number. You see, what he sees in the last half of chapter 7 is a contrast with the first half. The first half, there was a definitive number. First fruits. The house from the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, he sees a great harvest. He sees the culmination of the harvest. A great number from every nation stand before God. And they're clothed with white robes. And they are there before the throne. They have all emerged from great tribulation. You know, Paul says in Acts 14:22, it's through much tribulation, much pressure. That's what the word tribulation means. Through much pressure, much tribulation, that we enter into the kingdom of God. John sees these people who've come through, who've emerged through all of the pressures of life, who have washed their robes and made them white. And they stand before God and they serve Him day and night. And He that sits on the throne will dwell among them. They'll hunger no more nor thirst. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. End of verse 17. You see, the setting of this, what John sees, is the events he describes in detail back in Revelation 21. John sees the 144,000 seals. That's the starting point. And the conclusion is he sees now here individuals who are under threat, and yet they stand for God. Then in vision he looks and he sees the end of the story, which he describes in detail back in Revelation 21, of all of the multitudes who are ultimately standing before God as His children in the new heavens and the new earth. And that's what he sees here. Now, in chapter 8, he goes back, you see, to the time flow. 8:1, he opens the seventh seal. There was silence for a short time. And then I saw the 7 angels which stood before God. To them were given 7 trumpets. Now the 7 angels, verse 6, which have the 7 trumpets, prepare themselves to sound. This is the event of the day of the Lord, the great day of His wrath. That final period of time, most likely, when you put together prophecies in Joel and elsewhere, most likely that final year. The first angel sounds, and there are great cataclysmic events, and a third of the forests of our country, massive fires up in Montana, and some in other areas. And tremendous fires break out, and it's not only does damage to the places there, but then the smoke goes up and all of the damage and various other problems. Well, when this angel sounds, we find that there is hail and fire mingled with blood. They were cast upon the earth. Great flashes of lightning, great hailstorms all over the earth, great flashes of lightning everywhere. Can you imagine a lightning storm to the extent that 1/3 of the earth, 1/3 of the forests and the grasslands burn up? Can you imagine something like that? Lightning storms all over the earth. Great hail coming down, lightning flashing everywhere, and just whole sections. Thousands of acres, millions of acres simply going up in flames. Then the second angel sounded. There was a great mountain burning with fire cast into the sea. In other words, like a great asteroid that comes down. Great flaming comet or asteroid that comes down, and a third part of the sea becomes blood. It's red, thick. Just the result, of course, is that a third of the creatures in the sea die. A lot of the ships, a third of the ships are destroyed. It just totally disrupts everything. And the third angel sounded. Great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and the fountains of water. The name of this star is called wormwood. And the third part became wormwood, became bitter. Men died. So fresh water now is affected. So we've got 3 forests and grasslands. We have the seas. Now we have fresh water. And then a fourth angel sounds, and a third part of the sun was smitten, and a third part of the moon, third part of the stars. So what that meant was that a third part of them was darkened. The day did not shine for the third part of it, and the night likewise. So it's like there's some sort of all of this smoke and all these things that are up there, that it's like the whole period of sunlight and of night is affected. This tremendously disruptive event. God begins to send His judgments on the world. Chapter 9, the fifth angel sounds. And now we find that it describes, as it were, the great abyss being opened, the great smoke, like a great furnace coming up. And now we find, as it describes, this great army. And they didn't do damage to the ecology, but those men that don't have the seal of God, and they're for it. Now we saw back in Revelation 6, you see, or Revelation 7, before God allowed these angels to start pouring out these plagues, He set apart a group of individuals. Now, those who have not been set apart are tormented by this, and it describes, John is seeing in vision, and he's trying to describe, he talks about it being like locusts and sort of like horses prepared for battle, and breastplates of iron, and it sounds like many chariots going to battle, and they had tails like scorpions. If you were to see the weapons of modern warfare, if you were to see some of these big, a whole fleet of big attack helicopters going up, John described what he saw in the language that he had to describe it. If you and I saw something we had never seen before, and then you had to describe it to someone, how would you do it? You would say, well, it was sort of like this, and it looked sort of like that, it made a noise sort of like this, and it was sort of like this other. You would describe it using the terms that you knew. John, as it were, was transported in vision, and he was seeing, like on a, panorama and technicolor. He was seeing these events unfold. And he sees this called a great woe, a great unleashing of great military might. And then the response, when the sixth angel sounds the trumpet, 4 angels that have been restricted and bound there at the river Euphrates are now loose. And they go to prepare this great army, this great response, an army of 200 million, which is an area that lies east of the Euphrates. Primarily, in terms of the numbers, that would have to involve India and China. You couldn't put together an army of 200 million. Both of those countries have about 1 billion each. And historically, to put together an army that consists of more than 10% of the population is very difficult, because you've got to have all the support staff, and you figure people who are too old and too young and all the other things. So normally it's considered that to mobilize an army that consists of 10% of your population is a massive mobilization. Well, India and China together could certainly mobilize 200 million men. And that's not to say those are the only 2 countries involved, but those are the primary areas in terms of population. There's certainly other areas to the east that will be involved in that. But I don't see, you simply, east of the Euphrates, you couldn't get that many people without at least those 2 nations providing at least the core of the numbers, and then certainly others adding in on that. And this area of the Euphrates has become sort of the dividing line. The Bible talks about, in the book of Daniel, it talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. And here in Revelation, it talks about the kings of the east. It's interesting, there are 3 directions of the compass that are mentioned. There's no reference to any kings of the west. That's because the western powers, which are basically the English-speaking world, America and Britain, have been knocked out at the beginning of the tribulation, have already gone into captivity. All of these events have occurred during the course of after that has happened. So the king of the north is the European power, north of Jerusalem. The king of the south is the Muslim, the Islamic power, centered south of Jerusalem. The kings of the east are those areas east of Euphrates. You see, the whole world system begins now to break apart in disarray. And so this great Asiatic army launches an attack, and it describes in verse 17, out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. And by these was the third part of men killed, by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone. Sounds like a nuclear attack. I don't see how you can, with destructive weapons to destroy a third of the population of the earth. You just about have to use nuclear weapons. Well, what do you see? What would John have seen if nuclear weapons were unleashed? If he saw that in a vision, would it look like fire and smoke and brimstone? Mushroom-shaped clouds going up, great, fires breaking out, this massive attack. And so he sees this destruction. Now, we come to insets in the book of Revelation. Chapter 10 describes the inset of a little book. And the little book is delivered to John by an angel. So the little book's not something that's been written recently because John saw it. It's given to him. It came from an angel, so it's not something that some human being wrote. And John now sees this sort of sets the stage for chapter 11. He's given a reed, and he's told to measure the temple and the altar and those that worship. He's told in verse 2 that the holy city would be trodden underfoot 42 months. Matthew 24 tells us that Jerusalem will be trodden down to the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. That is the 42 months. It's described right here. It's given to the Gentiles, Revelation 11:2, and is trodden underfoot 42 months. Zechariah 14 tells you, you see, that all nations come up against Jerusalem to battle. The city is taken and half goes into captivity. Jerusalem is a divided city, divided between Arab and Jew. Which half goes into captivity? Well, the Jewish half. Those are the ones that the attack is going to be centered upon. You know, there's going to be an agreement. There's going to be a treaty, as it were, to which the beast will be a party, guaranteeing as a guarantor there. But he's going to violate that treaty. Daniel brings that out and shows how that he will come up with subtlety and with craft, and he'll violate that. Now, during the time when Jerusalem is trodden underfoot by the Gentiles, God will give power to His two witnesses to prophesy there for the same duration. 1,260 days, 1,260 days is the same as 42 months. You can figure it out, 3.5 years. So, while the Gentile power, the beast power, the German-dominated Holy Roman Empire has seized power in the Middle East, there are two individuals who are going to be there. You know, our responsibility now as a church is to preach the gospel of the kingdom to the world as a witness, and also to provide a warning of the impending events to the house of Israel, as we termed it, Mr. Armstrong termed it, the Ezekiel warning. To warn the house of Israel as a watchman, Ezekiel describes that. Because you see, Israel goes into captivity at the beginning part of all this. The two witnesses are here in Jerusalem, and their testimony is now to warn all of the world, certainly to warn the Gentile world of God's judgment upon them, upon the beast power. Israel is in captivity. First, God has dealt with Israel. Now He's going to deal with everyone else. The two witnesses continue to prophesy, and no one is allowed to harm them during that period of time. And then at the end, they are killed. But notice the timing on it. They're killed. They lie dead in the streets 3.5 days. And then, verse 11, after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood on their feet. Great fear fell on all them that saw. They're told to ascend, and they do. Verse 14, the second woe is past. Behold, the third woe comes quickly. That signal, verse 15, the seventh angel sounds. There are great voices in heaven, saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of His Christ, and He'll reign forever and ever. So now is the time for the seventh angel to sound. Now, Revelation 12 and 13 provide inset chapters. You know, these inset chapters, what they do is pick up the threads of a story and track it all down to bring you up to the point of Christ's return. Chapter 10 and 11 flow together to do that at the end of 11. Chapter 12 picks up the story of the church and traces that down, and the church is protected, nourished in her place in the wilderness for times and a half a time, this final 3.5 year period that's mentioned in verse 14. Then chapter 13 picks up the story of the beast, and it traces down the story of the old Roman Empire and brings it up to the point in the end of chapter 13, verse 16, when they cause everyone, insisting that everyone receive this mark of loyalty and allegiance to the beast system. You know, it is the brand of disobedience. The book of Colossians says that God will pour out His wrath upon the children of disobedience. The wrath of God is poured out on the children of disobedience. So the mark of the beast is a sign that identifies the disobedient with contrast them with the obedient. What is the sign of obedience? God gave His Sabbath, and He said in Exodus 31, it is a sign between me and my people forever. God's Sabbaths are a sign that identify those who obey the Creator. It was a sign established at creation, and it identifies those who obey the Creator. Here is a mark that originated in old Babylonian sun worship that is the mark of the beast that is enforced by this system. It says you're going to have to receive it. There's pressure to go along and be a part of that in order to participate in the economic system. Now, chapter 14, he sees the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and he sees the 144,000 standing there. The picture in Revelation 14 is clearly after the resurrection, because Christ isn't going to be on Mount Zion, and the 144,000 aren't going to be there with him until after the resurrection. What do they have in their forehead? The Father's name. What do the others have in their foreheads? Chapter 13, verse 16, receiving the mark. So there's a contrast here between those who receive the mark of the beast in their forehead and those who receive the Father's name in their forehead. And so he describes here this vision of the resurrection. And Babylon is fallen, verse 8. Babylon is fallen. The patience of the saints, verse 12, are those that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. See, the mark of the beast contrasts with those who keep the commandments of God. They're those who disobey, who break the commandments of God. See, those, verse 9, who worship the beast gave their loyalty and allegiance to the revived Roman Empire and to the Roman Church who received that mark. They will drink of the wine of the wrath of God poured out without mixture. They have been warned and warned and warned. We're looking at something. God's not going to pour out His wrath without mixture tomorrow on people who are just innocently going about their business and they don't have a clue. The wrath of God poured out without mixture is poured out after the warning of the church, and the church has been taken to a place of safety, after the two witnesses have prophesied for 3.5 years, after all of this warning and all of these things that have happened, all of these plagues, all of the things that God has done, now finally He says, yeah, I'll pour out my wrath without mixture. And so we find this contrast. Here on a white cloud is the Son of Man sitting, verse 14. And the time has come to reap the earth. Chapter 15, John says, I saw 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, and them is filled up the wrath of God. And he saw sea of glass mingled with fire, and those that had gotten victory over the beast in his image and his mark. They stood on the sea of glass, and they sang the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb. You know, there are those who think the Old Testament and the New Testament are contradictory. You know what the redeemed are going to sing? They're going to sing the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb. Those songs are in harmony. You see, the message of the Old Testament, the message of the New Testament fit together. The redeemed aren't going to throw away the song of Moses and say, oh no, you know, all that old stuff, that's been done away. The redeemed at the resurrection are going to sing the song of Moses, and it blends with the song of the Lamb. And it describes that. And the 7 angels having the 7 last plagues come forth. You see, the 7 seals are opened one by one. When the 7th seal is opened, the 7 angels with the 7 trumpets sound. When the 7th trumpet sounds, the resurrection occurs, but something else occurs. 7 angels with the 7 last plagues come forth. And they begin to pour out these 7 last plagues. Now, the 7 last plagues, as we're going to see, are poured out in a very short time. Revelation 17, it describes, you see, as you come on down here through Revelation chapter 16, describes the pouring out of the 7 last plagues. The first plague is poured out in verse 2, and a terrible great sores fall on those that have the mark of the beast. The second angel pours out his vial, and all of the sea became like the blood of a dead man, all congealed and rotten and stinking. Everything in the sea died. The third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and the fountains. All the fresh water became blood. And the fourth angel pours out his vial, verse 8, and great solar flares. People are scorched with heat. The fifth angel pours out his vial, and the seat of the beast becomes full of darkness. Now, obviously, these are things that are poured out in the course of a very short time. Days. at the absolute maximum. Because if all of the water became blood, if all the fresh water became blood, how long could life exist on the planet? You're not talking about weeks or months or years. You're talking about days at most. Because, there may be water that people have stored up somewhere. It doesn't say every bit of water in storage, or in a can or something, a water tower or something like that. It doesn't say all of that, but it says the rivers, all the sources of fresh water, all of the sources of seawater. So you've got absolute destruction. You've got events that transpire in a matter of days. When the sixth seal not the sixth seal, but when the sixth angel pours out his vial, then we find the kings of the east pour across the Euphrates. You see, what they did earlier was they launched a nuclear attack. Now the army itself pours into the Middle East, and they are gathered. They come there to Armageddon, and they meet the armies of the beast power there at Armageddon. And as we're going to see, they come on down to the valley of Jehoshaphat outside of Jerusalem to literally fight the returning Jesus Christ. The seventh angel pours out his vial, verse 17, and there is lightning and a great earthquake, and it describes this great destruction, and Babylon is fallen. And chapter 17 is sort of an inset describing Babylon the Great. Revelation 17 and 18 sort of tell you the story of Babylon the Great. This system ridden by a great religious power, ridden by a woman, a great economic system described in Revelation 18. And then Revelation 19 describes, you see, Christ coming with the armies to destroy the armies gathered out of Jerusalem. And chapter 20 describes the angel coming down to bind Satan, and then thrones set, and those that lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The Feast of Trumpets is a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. I think every indication of Scripture is that the final day of the Lord is a 1-year period. And if the symbolism holds true, then the first trumpet is sounded on the Feast of Trumpets, and over the course of the next year, the trumpets are sounded one by one. The seventh trumpet sounded on the Feast of Trumpets a year later. And the dead in Christ rise up to meet him in the air. Now, Satan is bound, and we'll go into that. I'm sure you'll hear sermons on it on the Day of Atonement. That's 10 days later. What occurs during that period? The final period of days that Satan is loose. Well, you read of the sequence of when the seventh trumpet sounds, the seven angels with the seven vials pour out their plagues, and those things transpire during those final days. And finally, then, by the close of that week, you see, the armies are destroyed, as it describes here in the end of Revelation 19. The beast, verse 20, was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived those that received the mark of the beast, and those that worshipped his image. These are cast alive into the lake of fire and brimstone. The remnant were slain. So this army is wiped out and destroyed. And now Satan is taken and bound. So these events of the seven last plagues are poured out in that time period pictured by the time between the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement, culminating finally on the Day of Atonement of Satan being set aside, being put away. And then the nations, Israel, begins to be regathered from captivity and brought there in time for the opening night of the Feast of Tabernacles, 5 days later. You see, I saw thrones and sat on them, those that sat on them. It is the inauguration of the millennium, of the millennial rule of Jesus Christ. Brethren, the times that we see that described, that 1,000-year period, when the nations will be rebuilt and retaught. When the knowledge of God will cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. Oh, there's so many other things that happen when Christ's feet stands on the Mount of Olives. The mount is split in two, and a great river gushes forth into the river, into the Mediterranean Sea. And you go back to the book of Ezekiel, you find that it actually breaks forth from under the Temple Mount, that fountain, from what will be literally under the throne of Jesus Christ, and it flows out, that river of living water. Ezekiel says it heals the waters. You see, all those waters of blood, what happens? Well, they're healed. You know, it's like a ripple effect. You can just imagine it as the living waters touch there in the Mediterranean, and it just begins, you could just watch it as it just begins to unfold, and what has been dead water begins to just turn fresh. And Ezekiel says that all the fish are made alive. You know, that you didn't know fish were going to be resurrected. Well, all the creatures in the sea. There begins a healing. That can only begin to happen after Satan is put away. The events here it describes in Revelation 19 are some of that period between, you see, the time of the seventh trumpet blast and the time when Satan is actually put away. That period of days that elapse that see the final unfolding and pouring out of the events of the seventh trumpet. We're here to memorialize the blowing of trumpets, because that final trumpet, while it ushers in judgment on the world, it ushers in the time when the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of His Christ. And He shall reign forever. The time is coming, brethren. The time is literally coming. There are a lot of things that we have to live through in the years immediately ahead of us. But we have a hope that lies on beyond that time. The God of heaven is going to step into history. God will step into history. And we will step in to eternity. We'll take a look at that this afternoon. Well, here we are in the afternoon service, the final portion of the Feast of Trumpets. You know, it's hard to believe. We wait through the months of summer, and of course we had a little more summer than usual this year. We always, you know, you can always count on July and August. I mean, it's the South, so it's supposed to be hot, right? But when it starts breaking records, and we had records broken in Dallas and in East Texas. I think you had some, I know you had some very hot temperatures, because I was up here during some of it. You were trying to rival us, but we were, you know, way up over 100 degrees day after day after day. And as you go through days like that, it just seems hard to imagine the time is actually going to come when it's going to be cool in the mornings, you know, and feast time is going to come here. The month of September opened, and we were having record-breaking heat up around 107, 108 there in Kilgore, 1st of September. And Thursday morning before we left to come up to Arkansas, my wife and I took a walk, and we got out early that morning and actually needed a sweater on. It felt good, you know, and that's feast is in the air. And as the weather begins to change, and of course that's just the way it should be. It's like, people we get thinking about the feast in just a matter of 2 weeks from last night. We will have the opening service of the Feast of Tabernacles and the various locations wherever you may be. And as you come out of that evening service, if the sky is not clouded over, you'll be able to look up and you'll see a big, bright, full moon. And we are at that festival season. It's certainly appropriate that we should focus in the festival seasons on things that specifically are relevant to God's plan and purpose as revealed in the festivals. You know, God emphasizes that there are 3 seasons in the year, 3 times in the year when we appear before Him. The early spring season of Passover and unleavened bread, the late spring season of Pentecost, and the fall festival season, the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Ingathering, as it was also called, because it was at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. It was right prior to this time, right around this time, that the crops that had been being harvested were gathered out of the fields and into the barns, because right after the fall Feast of Tabernacles was normally when the rainy season began in ancient Israel. And so they called it the Feast of Ingathering. They were gathering in the crops and preparing to go up to Jerusalem and to celebrate this festival. And these festival seasons highlight the very plan and purpose that God is working out. The harvest seasons in ancient Israel were a type of the spiritual harvest in which God is engaged. And they depict the various aspects of the plan of salvation. You know, most people think that salvation is sort of a one-time thing. Or if you grew up in the Baptist church, as I did years ago, you heard the phrase, once saved, always saved. Well, that's true if you understand what salvation really is when it's completed and when you are truly saved. Because there are really three phases to the process of salvation, typed by each of the three festival seasons. The first phase of salvation is justification. You're justified, made innocent, brought into harmony with God. Sinners are reconciled to God. The season of redemption and deliverance, that's what's symbolized and pictured in the early spring festival period, Passover and unleavened bread. First, we must be justified, made innocent, and brought into harmony with God. Secondly, the second phase of salvation is we must be sanctified, made holy. Feast of Pentecost pictures the pouring out of the Spirit of God, because it is through the indwelling of God's Spirit that we are sanctified, set apart, made holy. God's laws are written in our hearts and in our minds. The whole period of this time in which we're living, the time of what the Bible calls the first fruits harvest. God's character is being produced in us through His Holy Spirit working in our lives, and the trials and the tests and the things that we go through. You know, the trials and the tests serve to set that character. If you've ever been involved with sculpture, you know, sometimes when we're moving chairs and tables, you look back there and they have evidently classes that come in and make do sculpture work. And if you've ever been involved with that, you know that you take the clay and you moisten it with water and you make it pliable until the point that you can work with it, and you work with it and you shape it and you make it into whatever it is. Most of us, if we were making something, it probably wouldn't look like too much. I hate to think, you know, what kind of blob I would turn out. I think I made something, 40-some-odd years ago in Vacation Bible School. My mother may still have it around somewhere. It didn't look like much then, and it sure doesn't look like much now, you know. But somebody who knows what he's doing, it is an impressive thing to watch a potter at work who really has skills. It's just amazing, you know, as the wheel whirls around and he takes his hands and he shapes and it's like he just sort of moves them a little bit, and all of a sudden you see this vase or this article that is being produced. And it's there, and it's nice and it's pretty if it's done by a skillful potter. But it's soft. It's not something you can use. What has to happen? It has to go through, it has to be dried, it has to be fired. And it is through that fire that it is set. And it loses that elasticity. You know, if you take a ceramic vase or something and you smash it on the floor, and maybe you take a hammer and you pound it to powder, you couldn't take that powder, add a little water, and turn around and make something else out of it, could you? There is something that took place in the firing of that article, the firing of that vessel. There is something that took place that produced a change. And that clay, which was so pliable and able to be molded and shaped and fashioned, that clay lost forever the quality of elasticity. It was set, and no longer can it be made into another vessel. We go through the trials and the tests of the Christian life, which God compares to fiery trials, to set and to harden that character that God's Spirit is producing in us. The second of the three festival seasons pictures the second phase of salvation. God is sanctifying, making us a holy people unto our God through the power of the Holy Spirit. The third and final phase of salvation is the one that we're celebrating in this fall festival season. First, we must be justified. Then we must be sanctified. Finally, we will be glorified. We will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. This flesh will put on immortality. Death will be swallowed up in victory. We will break forth in shining glory. Glorified sons of God. He that endures to the end, Jesus said, shall be saved. We have been justified by His blood, and we shall be saved by His life, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 5. Salvation is completed at the resurrection, when this mortal has put on immortality. When we are glorified, born of the Spirit. And so we anticipate the fulfillment, the completion of the process of salvation that God has begun in your life and in mine, and the fact that God ultimately is going to deal with all human beings, all men and women who have ever lived. Ultimately, the dead, small and great, are going to stand before God, and the books of the Bible are going to be opened up to their understanding, and the book of life is going to be opened back up, as John explains in Revelation 20. And then they will be judged by the things written in the books. The Biblos, that's the term in the original. Same word we get our word Bible from. They'll be judged by the things written in the books, the same standard by which you and I are judged. Judgment must always be based upon a standard. I don't care what kind of judging you're doing, you have a standard that is the basis of that judgment. God's Word is the basis of His judgment. So we are here today on the Feast of Trumpets, the festival that inaugurates the 7th month in God's sacred calendar. And there is significance to that. Have you ever thought about the way God builds sevens into His holy days? To begin with, Leviticus 23 shows that there are 7 holy convocations that occur during the year. They fall during these 3 festival seasons. The first of the festivals, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, lasts for 7 days. You then count 7 weeks, beginning on the morrow after the Sabbath, during the days of unleavened bread, the day of the wave sheaf. You count 7 weeks to arrive at Pentecost. Then you come forward to the 7th month, and you come to the time, the grouping of the fall festivals. Feast of Trumpets on the first day, the Day of Atonement on the 10th day. Then the Feast of Tabernacles, which lasts for 7 days, followed by that final day, that 8th day, that last great day. So God has built in and designed a pattern into His Word, into His plan and purpose. We want to focus here in the concluding portion of the Feast of Trumpets on things relating very directly to this fall festival season and to its meaning. I think that a good place to begin is back in Acts chapter 17. The Apostle Paul, if you remember the story, had to flee from one city to the next. He had been in Thessalonica, had spent 3 Sabbaths there reasoning out of the Scriptures, as is brought out in Acts 17:2. And we find that there were those Jews who did not believe what he had to say, and they were moved with envy. Acts 17:5. And they stirred up, a few troublemakers, certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, is the description. That's usually the crowd that gets stirred up. And they set the whole city in an uproar. And Paul ultimately had to flee, had to get out of Thessalonica. And Paul and Silas left by night, and they came to a small little town by the name of Berea. And they went in there, and the people in Berea had a little different attitude. They listened to what Paul had to say, and we're told in Acts 17:11, they searched the Scriptures daily whether those things were so. And many of them believed. And also of honorable women, which were Greeks, and of men, not a few. So many of the Jews in Berea believed, and a sizable number of the Greek population, men and women, believed what Paul had to say because they had an attitude of searching the Scriptures daily whether those things were so. Now, after Paul had preached there for a little while, he left, and we're told he was brought on to Athens in verse 15. And Silas and Timothy were going to come to him, and Paul waited for them in Athens. Now, Athens was a major city. Athens was the center of education and culture in the Roman Empire. It was the city from which the teachers and the professors came. Even the great teachers in Rome had gotten their training in Athens. Athens was the location of the academy founded by Plato. It was a center of learning. It was a center of education. It was a major city, the major city in Greece. Of course, Thessalonica and Berea were also in Greece, but much smaller cities, particularly Berea. Have you ever noticed in reading the New Testament that you don't read about any big church in Athens? You ever thought about that? There's no mention of a church in Athens. If one ever existed, it was very small. In fact, we'll notice that in Berea, just a small little village, we're told many of the Jews believed, and not a few of the Greeks. Now notice, when Paul is here in Athens, we find that he went up to Mars Hill. Mars Hill, also called, actually the term in Greek is Areopagus. That's the Greek term that means Mars Hill. Mars was, of course, one of the Greek gods. This was a hill dedicated to him, and one of the things that took place on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, there was this location where people loved to gather, and when they were there, they loved nothing better than to hear or tell some new thing. Oh, that was the internet of the day. I mean, they couldn't tune in on the internet, but they could go to Mars Hill. And there was always somebody up there who had some unusual view. And Paul, when he came to town, and certain of the philosophers of the Epicureans and the Stoics encountered him, and they said, "What's this babbler going to say?" Others said, "Well, he seems to be talking about strange gods. He's got all these odd ideas about some other gods," because he talked about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him, we're told in verse 19, and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "We want to know what you're talking about. You bring strange things to our ears. We want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and the strangers that were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Oh, they liked to get up there and to debate and to discuss and to listen and to talk. So Paul began to address them, and he says, "I understand that you are very religious folk." That's really the better translation of it. He said, "Well, I've seen idols, statues all over this whole city. In fact, on the way up here, I passed one that was dedicated to the unknown God. So clearly, you've made statues to every god you know of, or you think you know of, and in case you left one out, you've made one extra. You've dedicated that to the unknown God. That's the one that I'm going to tell you about today. I want to declare the unknown God to you. I'm going to tell you about the God you don't know. The God that made the world and all things therein. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He dwells not in temples made with hands. He's not worshipped with men's hands as though He needs anything. He's not in need of anything you have to give. Rather, He gives to all life and breath and all things. He's made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. He has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. Do you realize that history is written in advance? The great rise and fall of empires, the ebb and flow of events, the rise of great powers, the departure from the scene of others who have played a significant role. God has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So, it's not an accident that certain nations rose to power at certain times. It's not an accident that the English-speaking nations rose to power beginning in the early 1800s and achieved possession of major strategic areas all over the earth. It's not an accident that certain other nations down through history, going back to Egypt and Babylon, going back to the Greeks of Alexander, going back to the Romans, going back to all of the rise and fall of powers, whether it's the Islamic powers and from Arabia or any of the others. It's not an accident that different ones rose to power when they did, and eventually their empires faded. The migration of peoples into certain areas of the world. God has determined the times before appointed, the bounds of their habitation. Paul goes on to talk about the fact in verse 31 that God has appointed a day. He has appointed a day in which He will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom He has ordained, whereof He has given assurance unto all men, and that He raised Him from the dead. God has appointed a day. God has appointed someone to carry out that judgment. God has raised that individual from the dead. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, well, we'll hear a little more about this later. Paul departed from among them. Howbeit certain men clave unto him and believed, among the which was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. You know, in the little village of Berea, we're told many believed, and not a few of the Greek women and men. Here, we're told 2 people by name, and a few others, probably members of their household, maybe a couple of friends, but basically there were 2 people. You ever thought about what the difference was? The difference, of course, to a great extent was attitude. The people in Berea listened intently, and then they searched the Scriptures to see whether it was so. They checked it out, proved it out, and believed what the Bible said, and they acted on it. The people in Athens were filled up with a lot of intellectual pride and vanity. They loved to hear and tell some new thing. That was what they enjoyed doing. I think that's one of the problems that we've had in the church in recent days. We've had what I would call a Mars Hill mentality that has gripped a lot of people. They love to talk about religion. They just don't like to prove it out and change their lives. Well, they like to discuss it, like to hear some new thing. Oh, you got a new theory on that. Oh, well, that's interesting, Never heard that before. And so, well, this guy says this, and this one says that, and the other one says something else. And boy, this fellow over here, he really got some different ideas. You ought to listen to him. Mars Hill. Mars Hill. Mars Hill never produced a whole lot of spiritual fruit. There were a couple of people. By and large, Athens was not a productive place, spiritually. Because Athens was filled with a spirit of intellectual pride. People who loved to discuss and to argue, to hear and tell. But they didn't have a humble attitude of searching the Scriptures, proving what God said, and changing their lives based on what God said. It's interesting what Paul addressed, the approach that he took with these people. He talked about, number 1, the unknown God, the Creator. And he said that Creator is going to judge His creation. He has determined the times before appointed, the bounds of habitation. The Greeks had had their day in the sun under Alexander the Great. Now the Greeks were a part of the Roman Empire. And the Greeks, of course, their pride rested on the fact that they thought they were smarter than everyone else. The Romans' pride rested on the fact that they thought they were more powerful than anyone else, so therefore they were the best. Everybody had something they were proud of. Jews were proud of what they knew about God. When you go through the book of Romans, Paul sort of ripped into everybody's pride. Made the point that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Jew, Gentile, with the law, without the law, doesn't matter. Everybody has fallen short. And God is going to judge the world, and we're here celebrating A day that is a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. A day that represents the time when the great God will step into history. A time that represents the ushering in of the final phase in God's plan. The final phase of salvation. Maybe we haven't thought of it in quite this way, but most of the Bible really follows through on the story of two men and two cities. The origins were intertwined, and the conclusions are intertwined. One is destined to be destroyed forever, and the other is destined to be created anew, to endure forever. This current world, this present evil world, as Peter uses the term, has its origins beginning in the events recorded in Genesis 10. After God's judgment upon the world in the days of Noah, He sent a flood and destroyed humanity. After the flood, the family of man began to increase rapidly. Genesis 10 and verse 1 says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood." And it begins to enumerate first the sons of Japheth, then in verse 6, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And in verse 7, the sons of Cush, Sheba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Ramah, and Sabteka, the sons of Ramah. And then we're told in verse 8, "And Cush begat Nimrod. Nimrod, began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel." That was the starting point. That was the city that Nimrod built. And you read of that city and the building of it in Genesis 11. Now Nimrod, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Then he went on to Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And out of that land, he went into Assyria, that's the better translation of it, and built Nineveh and the city Rehoboth and Calah. Now, the beginning of his kingdom, Nimrod, whose name derives from the Hebrew word marad, which means he rebelled, Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord, or in the place of God. Nimrod, the mighty hunter. As the human population began to increase rapidly in the aftermath of the flood, of course, everything had been wiped out. And animals reproduced very quickly, and of course they spread very quickly, and there were not the as the population, the land was there, everything was springing up, and very quickly the wild animals began to grow and to have great increase in population. And Nimrod was the mighty hunter. He presented himself as the protector and the defender. Then we're told in Genesis 11 verse 1 that the whole earth was of one language and one speech. After all, we're only about 100 years after the flood. And as it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, from the area of Ararat, where the ark had originally rested, the area of Armenia, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. That is, that area between the two rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. We call it Mesopotamia, which is simply a Greek word that means between the two rivers. And they said unto one another, "Go to, let us make brick, burn them thoroughly." They had brick for stone and slime they had for mortar, and they said, "Let's build a city and a tower. We're going to make a name." Now, God came down and beheld the city and the tower. And God saw that they did not want to follow his instructions, which were to spread out and to repopulate the earth. And so he confounded their languages and forced them to leave off the building of the city. The name of the city, verse 9, is called Babel. God confused the languages, and from thence he scattered them abroad upon the face of all the earth. As human beings spread out from Babel, they took with them the religion and the culture of Babel. And that's why when you look around the world at various pagan ideas, that there is a similarity. There are similar holidays and similar concepts that sprang from Babel. The city that Nimrod built. The beginning of Nimrod's kingdom was Babel. It was a symbol of rebellion against God. It was an attempt to have one world the devil's way. One world. Now we are rapidly moving today toward the concept of one world, linked together economically. But in order to be linked and to remain linked economically, there have to be military and political links, and the missing ingredient, the ingredient that is not yet there, is the glue to hold it all together, which is the religious link. You don't whip people up to an emotional fervor to maintain corporate profits. You know, people all over the earth don't get all excited about seeing some big multinational conglomerate getting bigger. And yet, as a result of this system, the merchants of the earth will wax rich. That's what we're told in Revelation 18. No, Babylon the Great involves religion, as well as economics, military, and political aspects. All four are together. They were all present initially in Babel, the city that Nimrod built. God intervened, confounded the people's language, and caused them to spread out. Different groups of mankind went into different areas. God didn't give a different language to every single person. He gave it to, certain family groupings. And so the various ethnic groups spread out, populated different areas of the world, no longer able to stay there and to talk and to understand one another. So they settled the areas because God had determined before the bounds of their habitation. He already had in mind where He wanted different people, different branches of the human family to settle. But the city that Nimrod built, while the building of the city and the tower was temporarily stopped, that city has continued on down. When we come to the book of Daniel, we read about a king who had come to power in Babylon, a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, who conquered Jerusalem. And he carried into captivity many young Jewish boys of noble families as well as others. There were 3 periods of captivity. After the initial invasion of Jerusalem around 604, and then another second invasion around 595, and then the final invasion around 586, where the third invasion is when the temple was destroyed. But Daniel was taken into captivity in the first invasion. And Daniel and others were taken to this city of Babylon. And Daniel had the opportunity to see the shaping up of this system. And God gave Daniel visions, gave him several visions, and initially had given a vision to the king of Babel, to Nebuchadnezzar himself. That vision is recorded in Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar had had a dream, and in his dream he had seen a great image that was mammoth in size. And it had a head of gold and shoulders of silver and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and the feet were of iron and miry clay, a mixture of iron and ceramic clay. Then in his vision he saw a great stone, a stone of supernatural origin, cut out without hands. And the stone descended from heaven and smashed the image on its toes. The whole image turned to dust and blew away, and the stone became a great mountain and filled the earth. Nebuchadnezzar was very puzzled, and he summoned his magicians and his astrologers, and he said, I have had a dream, and I want you to tell me what I dreamed and what it meant. Well, they said, well, King, you tell us what you dreamed, and we'll explain to you what it means. He said, oh, no, you don't. If you can't tell me what I dreamed, then why should I believe that you are inspired to tell me what it means? I'll believe your interpretation if you can tell me what I dreamed to begin with. Oh, they said, we can't do that. Nobody can do that. So Nebuchadnezzar, being a fellow who had a little bit of a fiery temper, gave orders that they be hacked into little pieces and their houses be made dunghills. So he sort of got mad, and he was ready to chop people up into little bitty pieces. That's what it says here. You know, word reached Daniel, and he really had no desire to be chopped up into little bitty pieces. And he and his friends sought God and went, they prayed to God and asked for an interview with the king. And Daniel came in before the king, and he said, King, I serve the God of heaven. And He is a revealer of secrets. And the God whom I serve will inspire me to tell you what you dreamed and what it meant. And God gave Daniel that understanding, and Daniel was able to recount to the king his dream. And the king just sat there, you can imagine, just in amazement as Daniel went through and recounted the details. And he said, this is what you dreamed. And the king said, yeah, that's right. And Daniel said, now let me explain to you what it meant. Well, the king at this point was certainly willing to listen because he knew that clearly Daniel had access to information that was not just on a human level. And Daniel said, you, O king, represent the head of gold. That represents you. And he says, after you, there's going to arise another kingdom, a second kingdom. That's symbolized by the shoulders of silver. And after that, there will arise yet a third kingdom, symbolized by the thighs of brass. And finally, there will arise the fourth kingdom upon the earth, symbolized by the legs of iron. And then these toes. In the days of those kings, those final 10 kings, symbolized by the 10 toes, you see, the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that shall never be removed. That's what we're told in verse 44. That kingdom is going to be set up, the stone cut out without hands. It's going to smash the image. Now, we know from history that what Daniel said came to pass. In fact, during Daniel's lifetime, he saw the first transition. The transition from the head of gold to the shoulders and chest of silver. That's recorded in the book of Daniel. You remember the story. It's one of the famous stories of the Bible. Belshazzar, you remember, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, who was having this big drunken party for all of his rulers, all of the men who ruled under him. They were having this big celebration. Interestingly enough, we know from history that the celebration was on the evening that began the Feast of Trumpets. It was the evening that began the first day of the 7th month. And on that evening of the Feast of Trumpets, as they were drinking and partying, you see, Babylon was under siege and had been for several months. Cyrus of Persia had an army encamped outside, but the Babylonians were proud. And they knew in their own mind, as far as they were concerned, their city was impregnable. The walls of Babylon were mammoth. They were so wide and so great that you could literally have chariot races around the top. It was of mammoth size and magnitude, the walls of Babylon. You couldn't break them down. Babylon had a tributary of the Euphrates River that actually flowed underneath it. And there were great, this provided them water, which meant that they weren't going to run out of water in the siege. The great iron gates and the great mammoth city, why, they knew no one could conquer Babylon. And so Belshazzar was really feeling proud of himself. And after they had been drinking for a while, Belshazzar gave orders that the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, which his grandfather had taken and brought to Babylon many years earlier. That those sacred vessels were to be brought into the banquet room, and that they would fill them with wine and drink to the gods of gold and silver, brass, stone, wood. Quite an audacious request. And as they laughed and talked and boasted, and as they sung their praises to the gods of gold and silver, and as they lifted high the vessels from the temple and made toasts to the god of Babylon, the gods of Babylon, all of a sudden, the party was over. Appearing mysteriously out of nowhere, this embodied hand began to write in fiery letters upon the wall words in the Babylonian language, but words that in the context seem meaningless to the people who read them. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. That's the way it's transliterated into English. The mina, the shekel, the perez were weights and measures. It's sort of like if you and I were to see something like that and written on the wall would be the phrase pounds, tons, and ounces. You know what the words mean. I mean, you recognize the word, but it's meaningless in the context. You have no clue what's all of that about. Obviously something pretty significant, because when a hand appears out of nowhere and begins to write on the wall, that would get your attention, wouldn't it? I would suspect about that time the drinking stopped. In fact, we're told the king of Babylon was so scared that he had a rather embarrassing accident. We're told that his knees smote one upon another and the joints of his loins were loosed. I will leave to your imagination what that means. You can check it up in a commentary if you want to find out. It scared him to death. You know, imagine. Here's somebody all filled with pride and all boasting and just filled up with all of this stuff, and they've been boozing it up and drinking through the evening. The hand writes on the wall. They were frightened. They didn't know what it meant. Finally, the king's mother suggested that why don't you call in a man who in the days of your ancestor Nebuchadnezzar was a man of great prominence. He was a man who had special understanding and insight. And surely he can tell you what it means. Daniel came in and he gave the interpretation. He read the words. And he says, you are weighed in the balances and found wanting. This very night your kingdom shall be divided to the Medes and the Persians. You're going to be killed, king. Your empire, your kingdom is going to cease. It's going to be swallowed up by others. That very night, you see, unknown to Belshazzar, Cyrus's troops had been performing a great engineering feat. They had, a ways away, dug a diversionary channel. And that evening, after dark, Belshazzar was boozing it up with his buddies there in the banquet room. The levee was broken. And that tributary of the Euphrates began very quickly to divert off into the other channel and to go into another portion of the Euphrates. And the channel that flowed underneath the walls of Babylon began to drop very rapidly in terms of its height. And within a matter of hours, the water was shallow enough that some of Cyrus's troops actually walked in the muddy river bottom underneath the wall, emerged on the other side, unlocked the big gates, and all the army came through and Babylon fell in one evening. In one night. Babylon was fallen. Daniel lived to see that. He saw that head of gold succeeded by the shoulders and chest of silver. He saw that second kingdom, the empire of the Medes and the Persians, arise. He records prophetically the events that history tells us about, that about 200 years after that event, Alexander the Great arose in Europe and Greece, crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with his troops, and within a short matter of time defeated the Persian armies and established the Greco-Macedonian Empire that covered the entire Middle Eastern area, from all the way from Greece all the way down across into what is now modern-day India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, down to Ethiopia. It included a vast area. Alexander's empire. Various of his generals continued it after his death, but it was the same empire in terms of language, culture, religion, philosophy. In the aftermath of Alexander's empire rose the final empire, the fourth of the ones that Daniel described, symbolized by the legs of iron. The Roman Empire, again a matter of history, swallowed up the components of the old Greco-Macedonian Empire, and the Empire of Rome was set up, fully established by 31 BC with the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony there in Egypt. And the Roman Empire had finally then swallowed up all of the remains of Alexander's empire. The Roman Empire is pictured as continuing on down through history, symbolized by two legs. Now, interestingly, the Roman Empire was divided into the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, and it continued down historically in those two phases. The Western Roman Empire gave shape and definition to Western Europe, to Latin, Catholic, Germanic Europe. The Eastern Empire, in the same way, gave shape and definition to Eastern Europe. Greek, Slavic, Orthodox Europe. Those two successors of Babylon, in reality of Babylon, of Persia, of Greece, of Rome, those two legs of the Roman Empire continue all the way down. And finally, we're told in the final days, Daniel saw 2 feet. And he focused in on the toes and the feet composed of a mixture of iron and ceramic clay. A mixture that is not well mixed. Something that a blow will shatter and will cause to separate. That is a very temporary situation that will arise. That attempt to put back together again the successors of both Eastern and Western Rome, of Rome and Byzantium, the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. It is in the days of those final kings that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be removed. You know, Isaiah talks about these things, referring to that system as the daughter of Babylon. Revelation uses the term Babylon the Great. It's not the same city that Nimrod built, but it is the successor to the city that Nimrod built. It is the continuation of that system, the Babylonian mystery religion that began with Nimrod. That system that continues all the way down, that will emerge once more as the daughter of Babylon, Babylon the Great, that great city that will rule over and dominate the entire world. Revelation chapter 17 describes the religious, military, and political components. Revelation 18 describes the commercial and economic. John in Revelation 17 saw a great woman, called here in Revelation 17:1 the great whore, a great prostitute that dominates many nations and tongues and languages and peoples. And this woman was pictured as sitting on a terrible-looking creature. She has a name, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And what John sees finally emerges in Revelation 17:12. He sees 10 kings, symbolized by 10 horns.
They are the ones who make war with the Lamb. So this is the final rulers of that system. They will be overcome by Jesus Christ. Revelation 17:14, these will make war with the Lamb shall overcome them, for He's Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with Him are called and chosen and faithful. You remember, brethren, we're told to make our calling and election sure. How do you make your calling and election sure? By remaining faithful. Those that are with Christ are called. There are many who have been called, but few who have been chosen. There are many who have heard the call. You know, a lot of people say, well, I wonder if God's calling. Well, I think the more appropriate question is, I need to wonder whether I'm answering. If I know enough to wonder, I wonder if He's calling. That's sort of like a kid, you're over here playing and you hear Mama calling, and I wonder if she means for me to come home. Well, why do you think she's out on the porch? The question isn't, for those of us here, the question isn't, are you being called? The question is, are you answering the call? How are you responding? Are you hoping, maybe you'll call back? Maybe you'll hang up and call back later. It's sort of not real convenient right now. I'm absorbed in something I really am enjoying doing. I don't want to quit and have to come, so maybe you'll call back later. Well, those that are with Him are called and chosen. Chosen. And faithful. God He must call and choose, but we must remain faithful. That's why Jesus said, He that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. To endure is to abide. How do you abide in Christ? You abide in Christ when His Word abides in you. That's what Jesus said in John 1. And John, you can go through and make a study of it. To be faithful is to be faithful to your calling. It's to be faithful to the truth. It is to abide in Christ, remaining faithful. Those that are with Him. You see, that's what we're anticipating. And we see here, as this system begins to turn upon itself, chapter 18 continues right on. He says, I'm going to show you the judgment on Babylon. All nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, Revelation 18:3. Babylon the Great is fallen. Is fallen. I heard another voice, verse 4 of Revelation 18, saying, Come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sin, that you receive not of her plagues. Her sins have reached unto heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. The judgment plagues of this day are judgments on Babylon. Babylon the Great is fallen. The city that Nimrod built will not endure. Oh, it describes the merchants of the earth being made rich as a result of this system, Revelation 18:15. And yet we're told in verse 17, in 1 hour so great riches has come to naught. It's going to go up in a mushroom-shaped cloud. And so Babylon the Great is fallen. Is fallen. It will become the hold of every foul spirit, the habitation of demons. That's where they're going to be kept during the period of the millennium. That's where the great abyss is going to be. Nimrod's city, the successor of Nimrod's city, the daughter of Babylon, will not endure. Nimrod and his system will pass from the scene. But right there And the next chapter that we had read in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 10 and 11, we read about Nimrod and Babel. In the end of Genesis 11, we're introduced to a man that is the most prominent figure in terms of a human being through the rest of the Bible. His name was Abram. Abram grew up in the very shadow of the Tower of Babel. He grew up in Ur of the Chaldees, not Ur up in northern Mesopotamia, as some commentaries say, but the Bible says Ur of the Chaldees, the land of the Chaldeans, was in the area of Shinar. The Chaldeans were the Babylonians. Abraham and his family left Ur of the Chaldees, went up into northern Mesopotamia to the area of Haran, and then from there he went on to the Promised Land. That's described in Genesis 12. God called a man out of Babylon. And He called him to come to a land that he would afterward inherit. And all of the promises were made to Abraham, and you and I inherit as the heir of Abraham, because Abraham was the father of the faithful. And God promised to Abraham the world. You and I inherit as his heirs. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees. He left the area of Babylon. And Abraham, at the age of 75, left Haran. And for the final 100 years of his life, he dwelt in a tent. He dwelt in a tabernacle, a temporary dwelling. But we're told in Hebrews 11 that Abraham lived as a stranger, a pilgrim, a temporary sojourner, but he was looking for something. Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham looked for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. Abraham lived in a tent. The tent doesn't have foundations. He just pitched a tent. I don't know about you. I camped for years in Big Sandy at Feast. A number of you did. I enjoyed it. But I'll tell you what, after about 8 days, I was sure ready to fold up my tent and go back and sleep in a real bed again. I always looked forward to the feast coming, but I was always sort of glad to fold up my tent. I don't think that the idea of living in a tent for 16 days or 16 weeks or 16 months or 16 years would have really been a real appealing thought. Abraham lived in a tent for 100 years. He left Haran when he was 75 after his father died, and Abraham lived to be 175. That's 100 years. And we're told that all that time he received not the promises. God promised him something, but Abraham lived in anticipation, and he died not having yet received the promises. That's what we're told in Hebrews 11. Abraham lived his life by faith. He saw something. Now, the irony? These two cities, because the city that Abraham looked for is the city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God, well, that's the city that you and I read of in the very end of Revelation. In Revelation 18, you find that Babylon the Great is fallen, it's gone forever. You get to Revelation 21. You read about a city coming down out of heaven from God, whose maker and builder is God, coming down to the earth. And that city doesn't just have one foundation, it's got a whole bunch of foundations. It's got 12 foundations. Abraham looked for that city, and Abraham died in faith, not having yet received it. But Abraham is going to inhabit that city. Now, these two men and their cities, Nimrod and Babylon, Abraham and the New Jerusalem, represent two entirely different ways of life and approaches to life. One is based on reality, and the other is based on an illusion. And yet the paradox is, the illusion is based on what people think they can see, and the reality is based on what you can't see. Now that sounds backward. But you could see the city that Nimrod built. It was built out of brick, mortar. It was an an impressive place. You could see it. You could touch it. It seemed real. And yet, the literal city has long since been buried by the sands, and the system and what it symbolizes, and the final daughter of Babylon is going to be destroyed forever and become simply the habitation of demons. What you can see, what seems so real, and in the years ahead, incredible pressure is going to be brought to bear on people to give their loyalty, their allegiance, their devotion to that system, to go along with it. Because based on everything you can see, you won't be able to live and function if you don't give your devotion and loyalty to it. If you don't accept the outward trappings of that system. How are you going to hold a job? How are you going to function? How are you going to do this? How are you going to do that? You see, if you base your life on what you can see, you're going to be part of something that's going to go up in smoke and be no more. Abraham, on the other hand, based his life on what he couldn't see. God made a promise and Abraham believed God. He believed God. Now, that's a very simple thing. And yet Abraham believed God, and the rest of his life was based on following where God led. And God led him down and said, Abraham, I got a place I want to give you. Abraham got there and he found out, he got sort of a rude awakening. He got there, number one, he found out other people were already there. Now, that can be a little bit disconcerting. Somebody said, I've got a beautiful house I want to give you. Here, let me show you where it is. So you go up there, and you get there and you think, my, that looks nice. But then you see that there are other people already living there. It's occupied. Cars in the driveway, curtains in the window, flower pots on the windowsill. Well, that's a great place, and I know that you're going to give it to me. I mean, you said you're going to give it to me. Who's going to break the news to them? I hope you are, because I don't think they're going to take it coming from me. Abraham got there and he found out the place was already inhabited, and then the next thing he found out was he got there and famine struck the land, and so he wound up having to go all the way down to Egypt to just keep his herds and flocks alive. Now, that could be a little bit disappointing. Not to mention the fact that he was 75 when all this started, and God said, I'm going to make of you a great nation. Of course, he didn't have any kids, and he must have thought, well, you're going to have to do it pretty quick. And God didn't do it pretty quick. In fact, he let a few years go by, and more years went by, and more years went by, and finally, when he was 99, God appeared to him and said, Abraham, I'm changing your name. You've just been known as Abram. I want you to go out of the tent. I want you to call all of your people together, all your servants, and I want you to announce to them that from now on you are to be known as Father of a Multitude. Now, he's 99. He doesn't have any kids, and he says, from now on I want you to call me Father of a Multitude, because we're about to get this thing started. That had to take faith, don't you think? People must have thought he's the most optimistic fellow I've ever met. But a year later, he had a son. Now, that's off to a running start. He's waited 99 years and he has one child. I'm going to make you father of a multitude. And that one child waited for years, finally got married, and he had two children. Well, boy, we're really moving forward now. Well, God says one of those doesn't count. We'll take the younger of the twins, and we'll make him the great nation. So now we're on the third generation, and we got one. Well, God gave him 12 sons, and then it began to multiply very rapidly. The point is, God knew where he was going. God was right on schedule. The times were before appointed. The bounds of their habitation were set. God had things planned out. But if you lived life based on what you saw, you'd never come to that conclusion. You would have never thought, in fact, if you're going to look at it on a human level, you'd have to say, you'd looked at Abraham and said, well, you poor fella, you really, I don't see how this can happen. This can't work. This won't happen. You would have thought, just on a human carnal level, Abraham was the one basing his life on an illusion. But you see, it was the reverse. Abraham based his life on the promises of God. And there's nothing more real than the reality of God and His Word and His promises. Abraham died in faith, not having yet received the promises, but he saw them afar off. He was persuaded of them. He confessed that he was a stranger and a pilgrim. He looked for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. The time is going to come. We're here celebrating memorial of the blowing of trumpets, when Jesus Christ is going to return to this earth. And He's going to usher in that final phase. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and King David, and the Apostle Paul, and Peter, and James and John, and any number of others, men and women that you and I have never even heard of, as well as some of the great heroes of the Bible, are going to rise in the air. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Some, including even friends and family that you and I have had, who have died in the faith and are buried. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the sound of that last trumpet, they're going to begin to emerge from the ground. The dust will no longer hold. The grave will no longer be their prison. They're going to come forth not as a weak human being, but in power and glory. Their face shining. That body that was sick, weak, that finally died, that had decayed and returned to the elements from which it was made, that body is going to come forth in a great and glorious body. Those of us that are alive and remain won't precede them, but immediately afterward we ourselves will also undergo a change. And this mortal will put on immortality. You and I can't even fully grasp what it would be to have your body undergo that transformation. No longer sick and tired. No longer all of the things that afflict us in the flesh. But in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, changed. That which is born of the flesh is flesh. You and I are flesh. But that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. And you and I will step into eternity in a moment and in the twinkling of an eye. Jesus Christ is going to set up a literal government on this earth. You and I are going to have a position and a place in that government, a place in that kingdom, as are the men and women of whom we read in Scripture. We're going to live and reign throughout this 1,000-year period. Then God's going to deal with the rest of humanity, those who've never had an opportunity. And then the incorrigibly wicked, those who have had their opportunity and have sinned willfully, have turned aside knowingly, are going to be brought up to face their final judgment and punishment and to perish in the lake of fire. That fire that will sweep over and purge the face of the whole earth. Because a new heavens and a new earth will emerge in the aftermath of that fiery conflagration that will consume this earth. A new heavens and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. And the heavenly city, New Jerusalem, will come down from God out of heaven, and Abraham, who lived his life in anticipation, will see that city whose maker and builder is God. That city that you and I are destined to inherit. That city that you and I are destined to inhabit. That city's going to come. It's going to be established. The Bible closes at that point, leaving us standing on the very brink of eternity. Nimrod and Babylon will be no more. Abraham and the New Jerusalem will be forever. You see, the way of life based on faith is based on what is real. That which is based on sight is based on an illusion. It's based on what is temporary. We're told in Romans chapter 8, in verse 16, that the Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. If so be that we suffer with Him, that we may be also glorified together. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. I don't care what you and I may be faced with, what we may have to go through right now, or what we may have to go through in the years ahead. There is nothing whatsoever that is worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. God is bringing many sons unto glory. We're heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. Glorified together with Him. The Apostle Paul talks about in Hebrews chapter 10. Talks about in Hebrews chapter 10, in verse 23, he says, "Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. For he is faithful that promised. Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching." You see, we're told in verse 32, "Call to remembrance the former days, in which after you were illuminated, after you understood and saw the truth, you endured a great fight of afflictions." You went through a lot of things. He says in verse 35, "Don't cast away your confidence, which has great recompense of reward, for you have need of patience, that after you've done the will of God, you might receive the promise. For yet a little while, and He that shall come, and will not tarry. Just shall live by faith. If any man draw back my soul, shall have no pleasure in it." He that shall come, and will not tarry. Do you and I, can we really fully grasp that? That the time is literally going to come when the trumpet blast will split the air. And when finally the culmination of God's plan of salvation begins. When He that shall come will come. He really, really will. He that shall come will come, and will not tarry. Brethren, we're here celebrating a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. A memorial of all of the trumpets, and in particular, that final and seventh trumpet, which will signal the coming of Him who shall come. He really, really